scholars played a role in how to view Mahayana Buddhism and the various groups of people who subscribed to this religious lineage. And I think this is a really important topic of research, and you cited many of the people who are leading scholars in this area. And I think it's important because, as you point out, a lot of the categorizations we use and assume to be correct in depiction are actually based on presumptions that were made by a handful of researchers who had made a particular or who had a particular agenda in mind. The example that you gave is Mahayana Buddhism itself. You point out that at its outset, Mahayana Buddhism wasn't really as mutually exclusive from Theravada Buddhism as we are inclined to make it out to be. In fact, the Bodhisattva path, which is discussed to mark the difference between the two vehicles, can be seen in the Theravada tradition as well, and something, as you say, that Jana Tier points out. So then this kind of, my first question, or my first set of questions, I guess I should say, makes me kind of wonder, are we in today's day and age doing anything to guide the conversation of Buddhism in such a way so as to push forward our own agendas, and if so, what do you think might be some of those prejudices that, or biases or inclinations that we might have as we are studying Buddhism today? And the broader issue, of course, being, can we even engage in the study of Buddhism without employing our prejudices, biases, and inclinations?
Thank you for these thought-provoking questions. One of the first things that comes to mind, right, is that I can remember various papers that I wrote in grad school, and I want to start at the beginning and just unpack all of the problems before I actually say anything interesting. And the teachers would be like, well, you don't have to do all of that front loading, or, you can tuck it in a footnote or something, right? And but then at other events that I've spoken at, you kind of do need to do that front loading, because sometimes the people in the audience might be approaching it from a very particular perspective that they might not know, has some problematic background, or and then they'd be receptive, like, oh, I didn't know that, like, that's great. And then other people might push back and get mad. That's one of the reasons why you shouldn't waste too much time doing online message boards, because people are not necessarily there to engage in dialogue, right? One of the other things that was interesting to me once I started studying this material, and I'm a medievalist, but I started out as a modernist, and I got lost somewhere, and then I ended up in Kamakura. I don't know what happened, but in working through this material, kind of the late 1800s into the 1900s and on, is Burnouf and some of these other people are beginning with hypotheses. Like Burnouf even says, like, this is a hypothesis. This is how I think this is laid out. Then you read 50 years later, 100 years later, and so on. The hypothesis was taken as gospel and just repeated again and again and again. One example of this kind of intractability that comes to mind is that this is from an article by Christian Wedemeyer. I think it's called Tropes, Typologies, and Turnarounds, or something like that. It's a wonderful article, and he discusses this great French scholar, Louis de la Boulay-Poussin. Love that name, right? So Poussin is an early scholar of Buddhism. He's trying to make sense of things, and one of the questions he had is about Tantra. How do we think of Tantric Buddhism? Now, people like Burnouf and others saw Tantra as this poison, this this thing that corrupted Buddhism and then ultimately killed it in India, right? And Poussin is looking at these texts and practices, and he's like, the thing is, I don't think Tantra was actually that late. Like, all the things that you guys are labeling as Tantra seem to be all over the place from the beginning, right? It seems to permeate the whole thing, permeate the whole church. But because the doctrine of early pristine Buddhism, later Mahayana Buddhism, and then wicked Tantra was the gospel of Buddhist studies at the time, like, the field rejected his assertion. He's like, okay, never mind, I'll quit studying Tantra then, right? He did other very important, interesting things. 100 years later, scholars are like, oh, he was totally right. Like, Tantra is another kind of floating category that is imbued with all of these ideas that are, one of the things that Wedemeyer does in his great book called Making Sense of Tantric Buddhism is he looks at all the scholars that label Tantra as medieval. Then he looks at the date ranges that these scholars are defining as medieval, and it's all of Indian history, right? Yeah, but one of the other things that I've really been thinking about is this dichotomy between the academics, they got the elbow patches and everything, and objective truth versus the practitioners, the people who just don't know any better, right? And that's kind of the perspective that you get. So there's this clear dichotomy. But when you start picking away and looking at some of the assumptions that scholars are bringing to the table and then taking up the mantle of objective truth, like there are problems that need to be investigated. And in Don Lopez's article in the book Curators of the Buddha, which is about Buddhist studies under colonialism, the curators of the Buddha are the famous Orientalists, right? He makes this interesting point that that kind of a perspective on Buddhist studies that is on the one hand, skeptical of claims made within traditional context, but also skeptical of claims made by academics, because there is this tricky history that needs to be critically examined as well. One of the other things that I want to point out is that that there is this dichotomy of like pristine early Buddhism. Pick up an edition of some of the popular English language publications. You're going to see this dynamic, this early Buddhism dynamic. But so there's pristine Buddhism and then later Buddhism. There, it's this kind of idealized form of Buddhism versus the lived reality. The Buddhist traditions that British imperialists and missionaries were seeing in China or elsewhere. There's a book by Ryan Annington on kind of Aryanism and racial theory within early Buddhist studies. Like they believed that they were resurrecting the Aryan philosophy of the Buddha, versus the lived religion in Asia at that time. And they these early scholars really saw that clear dichotomy, like they were doing something important for the world, right? And so on. So the way that these Orientalist tropes and kind of play into that dynamic is also something that many people just don't know about, but has become part of the conversation in academic circles. It's a very important part of the conversation, I think. So,
okay, thank you very much. Curley, did you want to add anything on this subject, or okay, great. just chime in whenever you want to. Okay, yeah. Some of the things that popped into mind as you're explaining that is it seems like we want, as just people in general, we want to fit things into nice categories and into nice little boxes. Oh, sorry, I don't have this calendar. And so one of the things that comes to mind in terms of today's Buddhism and how it gets discussed is terms like mindfulness, terms like meditation. Are we clear about what these terms mean? And for the Nembutsu itself, Buddhana Smriti is a reflection, thinking on the Buddha, right? And so thinking on the Buddha, that's arguably meditation, right? And so so I think when we discuss these terms, I think we throw it around a lot. We see it a lot in these magazines when we're go grocery shopping and we're in line and we're just kind of looking at the National Geographic and stuff like that, and we see these different magazines that talk about these terms and throw them around, expecting to know that everybody's on the same page about how we define these terms. I think is something that would be good to kind of be wary of as Buddhists, I think, in today's day and age. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think I'm going to move on to another question that I have for Curley, sensei here. So let's see. So you present the cases of Shimaji Mokurai and then Nakanishi sensei and then Kurata Yakuzo, Nonomura Naotaro, and then last person here. And then Keta sensei, yes. And so I think those were helpful not only in their contrast, in the different to contrast their different contributions to the development of Shin Buddhism in the modern period, but also to show the different ways in which we can engage with this religion in today's time. So, and these were attempts that were made by these modern thinkers to make Buddhism relevant to the changing times, especially in Japan's turbulent Meiji period and then onward. So my question is regarding one of the terms that you come up with. I didn't hear it too much today in the presentations, but it definitely came up in your notes, was this idea of autonomy. And so I was wondering if you could, if you had like a specific definition in mind with autonomy, and then how that fits into, what your presentation today, and if you have any kind of thoughts on that. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, so it's true. I was using this term autonomy in the outline, and then I dropped it. So I thought, oh, it's a bit, it's starting to confuse me a little bit. But there are two concepts that are coming together under that term, I think. And one of them is the idea that I talked about a lot, which is the idea of self-mastery, like being a lord of yourself. Sometimes in my book, I talk about that as self-sovereignty. So to be the one who determines who is in charge of your own realm. That's considered a really important capacity that modern people are supposed to be trying to develop. I think that's still true today. I have a friend in who lives in the Bay Area. We were talking about her kids during COVID. I'm sure other folks in the room and on screen had similar experiences. Her kids are little, still in school, and her 6-year-old who's going to school in San Francisco, as part of the school's response to COVID, they had each little student had to make an area in their room that was a special place that they could go when they were feeling emotionally overwhelmed, and they were supposed to be able to say to their parent in times when they were feeling emotionally overwhelmed, I feel emotionally overwhelmed, I must go to my place. And then they were supposed to go to their place and just kind of wait there until they weren't emotionally overwhelmed anymore. And she told me about her 6-year-old, very seriously saying to her, I'm emotionally overwhelmed, I must go to my place. And I thought, oh, they're teaching these little kids self-mastery. That's exactly the kind of technique that 40-year-old men in Japan in 1910 were also trying to develop, right? To be able to say, I feel emotionally overwhelmed, I must go to my place. Right. So there's that kind of self-control. And then there's another dimension to it, which is kind of captured in the Japanese notion of shutai, which is just being a subject, or like having an inner depth and an interiority that you can draw on. That's actually kind of like, I have a place and it's inside myself, right? Like I can go inside myself when I need to. So the question of developing that kind of capacity is really central for these modern thinkers. And the thing that has been very interesting to me is that they want to develop this kind of autonomous subjectivity, as this free, self-mastered, self-controlling subjectivity. And of course, doesn't that sound like a self? Doesn't that sound like a stable self? So if this kind of question that I'm trying to pursue over this long period of time has been like, oh, why do Japanese thinkers believe that Buddhism is the place to look for a self? It seems like it's not intuitive. That if you want a strong self, you should go to Buddhism, right? But nonetheless, they do very consistently see in Buddhist teachings and practices ways of developing a strong self, and they also see the doctrine of no self as actually teaching something about a self. So I think that's very interesting in itself, and then I think that's also got, for me anyway, it has some traction in the contemporary moment too. I mean, you're talking about mindfulness and other kinds of techniques. How do we think about those in relation to a doctrine of no self? And what does it look like when Buddhism attends primarily to the individual versus attending primarily to interdependent relationships? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that I think about or that came to mind for me was about these modern thinkers that focus on this self, jiga or shutai, that it's almost like I get this sense of like volleyball where they like there's you setting it up so that someone could come in and spike it because it's this focus of Buddhism in the end is supposed to be talking about no self, right? And so the goal is supposed to be no self. So it seems like that it's this focus on the self as this step towards coming to know self, or how can we come to understand the true significance of the teaching of no self by way of studying the self? It seems like that's what the modern thinkers were really keen on focusing on. Yeah. Yes. Robin, say any kind of thoughts there, or?
So one of the things that I think relates to this, in kind of approaching Buddhism from the other side, kind of Buddhism as a way of thinking about the self, right? And of course, how no self is understood, there are a couple different sides, right? Like, is it to say that the self does not exist, or is it to say that like the self as a self-contained entity, or the spark of the divine within that is the unchanging true self, that's not a thing. I can remember as a teenager finding the doctrine of no self kind of terrifying. Like, what do you mean? I'm still making mine. Like, what do you mean it doesn't exist, right? But that also reminds me of, the comment on categories and how, these categories are formed in the early academic context, or, the categories are formed in the kind of formation of sectarian institutions in early modern Japan, or whatever. These categories come to take on a kind of swabhava, which is, like own being, or, which is what the doctrine of emptiness or shunyata is said doesn't exist, right? We attribute own being or swabhava to entities. We imagine, okay, this is the essence of this thing. The Nagarjuna or the Buddha or whoever's coming out and say, well, actually things are dependently arisen and impermanent, and therefore they're lacking of any unchanging core. But in an academic context where you're supposed to be studying Buddhism, and you're attributing what I would call swabhava to categories, whether it's Pure Land Buddhism or esoteric Buddhism or Zen or whatever, it's like, well, this is what it really is. This is the essence of Buddhism. Well, how could Buddhism, a tradition says there are no essences, have an essence, right? This is kind of a fun thing that I've been thinking about. But then, more recent, I think scholarship, this kind of postmodern world, drawing upon the ideas of the postmodernists that are kind of deconstructing these categories. It's like, perhaps shunyata is once again a useful tool for thinking about how to do Buddhist studies, like rather than things as independent and isolated and self-existent. Rather, things are dependently arisen, and I always have to look at context and diverse agendas that come together to make a thing happen or whatever. So that's something that's kind of been on my mind as well, as a way to kind of critique the way things have done by actually using some of these other Buddhist ideas and we get short shrift.
I'd like to open this up to the floor. Does anybody have any kind of questions or any comments so far? Please feel free to raise your hand, or also in the chat box. We're having a fun time conversating here, but we would like to include everybody else in this conversation if you would like to give some of your thoughts as well. Okay, so I'll just kind of throw that out there. One of the things Curley said that kind of struck in as you were talking about Nonomura Naotaro Sensei is that you mentioned that that he mentions that myth only works when it's suited to the age, right? And that when it's not suited to the age, then it no longer works. So we got to drop those things. And so then immediately what came to mind for me, because half of me is a Kaikyoshi minister, so it's a minister at a temple. I thought to myself, well, maybe what's not, like, how does this apply in our situation as ministers? Maybe the story of America is not jiving well with the audience here in America. Not only for the JA community, but Japanese American community, but also for the non-Japanese American community as well. Because the fact of the matter is, if you go to In-N-Out and you look at the bottom of the cup, it says John 3:16, right? Or if you see a lot of these quotes on the billboards, they're Christian comments, right? You don't see Amida Buddha, a sign of Amida Buddha anymore. That's reinforcing our thoughts of what it is to be a Buddhist here in America. And so I think there's a sense of loneliness, and there's a sense of kind of like, this only works within the walls of the Hondo doors, and once I leave the temple, all of a sudden, like I'm in a different kind of paradigm, so that struggle, I think, is something that I saw. And I think, Nonomura sensei is trying to address that. And as Tanaka sensei mentioned, he went too far with that, but also with Keta sensei and trying to, bring back the myth and the importance of that. And so that was just something that came to mind as I was hearing you do your explanation. Do you have any thoughts on that, or?
I mean, it's just very moving to think about it from that point of view. In a certain way, I think you're describing an experience that Nonomura doesn't have, which is to actually be living in a world in which the myth is not kind of pervasively present for you, right? To try to maintain that story when it has not saturated the landscape in the way that it had for him. I think there's something, one of the reasons I think that Professor Tanaka is sort of interested in Nonomura despite his problems, and one of the reasons for sure that I'm interested in him too, despite his problems, is he is like us in the sense, I think, that he understands himself as in a moment of danger and opportunity, right? And the danger is that the tradition will simply disappear. And the opportunity is, because it might disappear, because its strength is sort of called into question, you can make these very big changes. And for me, part of the excitement of thinking about American Buddhism is that it's in that kind of place now, right? Like we don't quite know what the future is, but maybe something really big could happen. I also take some comfort in the fact that when I look at Nonomura and other people in his generation, they are saying like, within a year, unless we make a dramatic change, within a year, Buddhism will simply be dead. And here we are, and it's 100 years later, and people are still saying, within a year. So it gives me a little bit of kind of reassurance, right? That the timeline, we have more time than we think. Hopefully.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's very reassuring to hear.
I was thinking about, this, this push to demythologize. And I'm reminded of this this fun book that I've used in my Lotus Sutra seminar. It's Don Lopez's biography of the Lotus Sutra. The series of great religious books and different biographies, and one on the Lotus Sutra. And at one point, he mentions that his students don't necessarily like the Buddha of the Lotus Sutra. Right? They walk in the door already, some of them already liking Bernou's Buddha, right? Or what I call the Barnes and Noble Buddha. Like they already come in like this kind of rational, philosophical science of the mind, et cetera, a little bit of mindfulness, a little bit of incense, we're good to go. It makes me think of my, some of the Alan Watts books I bought at hippie communes that smelled like Nag Champa for a really long time. Like, that's a vibe. That's an approach to Buddhism. But then they come to a class on like the Lotus Sutra, and it's like, the Buddha is revealed to be this, cosmic father figure that is guiding beings to awakening. And they're like, what now? That's not my Buddha, and you could substitute the Buddha of the Lotus Sutra with Amida or Mahavairochana or the Medicine Buddha or whoever. It's like, okay, now we're like in the weeds in this this genre of text I'm not used to. Like I warn my students, right? Or I prepare them. I say, no one in this room, as far as I know, was a 2,000-year-old Indian monk. So this text is going to be weird. It's okay, right? In a couple weeks, you'll be fine. Right? But just prepare yourselves. And kind of along the way, as they're getting accustomed to learning how to read a Mahayana text, I then provide them with some of the history, like here's where your Bernufian Buddha has come from, and here's why maybe we could ask some questions of that, and we could listen more closely to the tradition, and see not just what the text says and what it means, but what it's doing in the lives of actual human beings. And then by the end of it, maybe the Buddha of the Lotus Sutra is not so bad after all, right? I'm not maybe not quite as fatalistic on it. I think that with time and exposure, I was like, oh, actually, this is a whole thing. This is really interesting. And I found your discussion of Nonomura and Keita so interesting, because I think many people experience that like, okay, well, we're moderns, and I took science class, and well, now what, right? Then Keita comes in and is like, well, here's what, right? Think deeply about these things, because they reveal something very powerful about the human condition and interconnectedness. And even though we had this striving for self-autonomy, which interestingly, there's a term that Dohan uses, jizai, which means something like sovereignty or whatever. It's like one of the great attainments through these esoteric rituals is you're like able to, like a hot knife through butter, do whatever the hell you want, but actually we are embedded. We're always in a context or relationship, and that's what part of the magic that these traditions can, in magic, like keeping that magic there, and I think that that's really important. So I was really, it's like the demythologization. I can sympathize with that. But then Kit comes like, oh, I like this better. This.
Yeah.
So,
Great.
Yeah.
I do want to get to a question that was raised by Eric Hammerstrom Sensei. He says, you've been touched on this a bit, or you both touched on this a bit, but one live option for understanding Pure Land in China is Yushin Jodo, which is one way to deal with the challenges of the myth of Pure Land for modern people. I think this has been rejected by Nisshin Honganji today. Yeah, it actually has. It's mentioned in the preface of the chapter on Shinjin. But was this something that was talked about by the thinkers you've studied? And by Yui Shinjodo, he's talking about if your mind is purified, everywhere you are is the Pure Land. So did you guys kind of have any thoughts on this, or?
So thanks for that question, Eric. It's really, really a good one. I'm trying, a lot of these thinkers are new to me, and I'm trying not to kind of flip through the catalog in my mind to think of whether they address this. And I have a sort of fear that one of them did, and now I can't quite put my finger on what they had to say about it. So saying that makes me think it's certainly not, it does not seem to have been the idea that gained enough traction to be put forward by any thinker who was involved with or associated in some way with Shin, and Keta does not seem to be talking in that way either. I'm wondering if that idea, in the kind of history of polemics around Shin thought in Japan, that idea is taken up by Zen thinkers as a cudgel against Pure Land thinkers. So I wonder if that, produces a kind of history in which it's just not, not really available for thinking with, because it's so loaded with a backstory in which it's used to kind of belittle or diminish the Shinshu understanding of Pure Land. But Aaron would know better than me about that longer history.
So I've been really interested in this idea, and this is something that Charles Jones goes into in his books on Chinese Pure Land. And yeah, so as Reverend Miyaji mentions in the third chapter of Kyogo Shinsho, Shinran rejects something like this idea, right? This is obviously in the 13th century, and Yushiki Jodo is a kind of a later concept, but not really. Where Shinran says that like people are like stuck, or like stuck in this idea of self-nature Pure Land, and then they denigrate the Pure Land perspective that he is perhaps wanting to wrestle with. And it seems, and based on my reading, is like that immanentalist perspective, according to Shinran, is another way for the ego to take control of what the Pure Land path can do, right? Oh gosh, the Pure Land's already here, right? My mind is already the mind of the Buddha. Good for me, right? And again, and I think that, whereas Dohan has, still faith in the institution, I think that Shinran had lost faith in the institution, had lost faith in the elite dudes in golden clothing who would say, oh, it's all oneness, right? Because when it's all oneness, they could also say, we own this, right? This is all our purview because it's all one, right? So I think that Shinran has a specific polemical intent in rejecting or critiquing that perspective because he could see it as a function of ego. That's my, my reading of that. I think in kind of the common way that Yushin Jodo is often read, like a mind-only Pure Land, I think we might see some parallels in Dohan. But I mean that in a way that's a little bit different. I don't just mean that this immanentalist view of the Pure Land is fundamentally here and now, the Buddha is fundamentally one's mind, seems to collapse the binary. And I think that Dohan and other Mahayana thinkers preserve that tension. I think that one of the pervasive Mahayana perspectives is certainly, right, be a good Buddhist, pay your temple, pay your priest, eat your veggies, say Namo Amida Butsu, and go to the Pure Land when you die. Like that is one perspective, and it's a pervasive perspective. But when we look at like kind of Mahayana philosophical thinkers, they're also playing with this immanentalist and dualist view simultaneously. So I think that they often preserve that tension between, yes, ultimately it is here and now, but I'm hungry, I'm persecuted, I am afflicted by various karmic baggages, right? And I think that also in some Chinese, mind-only Pure Land thought, I think they also preserve that tension. If I'm remembering Charles Jones correctly, that tension is not necessarily resolved, so that the Pure Land to the West has a kind of reality, right? But not necessarily a literal reality in the sense we would maybe define that. So again, I think that that's an overly complicated explanation. I think that these ideas are present within texts like the Vimalakirti Sutra, which I mentioned, right? One of the Buddha's disciples says, like, so I've got the Pure Lands, and you're the Buddha of this land, so this must be your Pure Land. Why does your Pure Land suck, right? And Buddha's like, oh, but check it out. Touches the ground with his toe, poof. This is actually the Pure Land. It was like, oh, wow, I'm like a bodhisattva now. And then, touches it again, and it was back to normal. It's that, the land is purified in relation to the purity of the mind, right? So there's the underlying reality, and, but there's the like positionality of beings, right? And then you have, Tiantai thinkers that are talking about the three truths. There's emptiness, provisional reality, and the union of the two. And the Bodhisattva sociologists see both realities simultaneously. That's another way, I think, of resolving that tension within the tradition, or at least engaging with that tension within the tradition, with two truths, three truths, and so on. So I don't know, it's a big complicated thing. And this is one kind of way of dealing with that, right? But I have also met other, I've met Chinese monastics who are like, no, the mind is the Buddha, this is the Pure Land, get over all that other stuff, right? So that is also a position, right?
Really, really, really interesting. Thanks. It's also kind of bringing up a little inkling of something for me, which is some modern Pure Land thinkers are very interested in mind-only philosophy, and what they are not, it seems to me, quite willing to say is that it's my own human mind that is identical with the Pure Land, or it's not my own human mind in which the Pure Land is established. So they are willing to say, and no wonder, because it's not very controversial, is it? They are willing to say that the Pure Land is the mind of Amin the Buddha, and they're of course willing to say that Amin the Buddha is identical with the Dharmakara. So there is a mind that is identical with the Pure Land. And then the question becomes, well, what's the relationship between that mind and my own finite, limited mind? And that's the place where I see them kind of trying to hold on to that tension that Aaron is describing, clearly thinking there's something productive there in hanging on to a difference, a separation between the finite being and the Buddha, which I think of as a distinctive feature of Pure Land thought as well. Japanese Pure Land thought.
Since it continues on with saying, thank you both. That's really helpful perspective. On Japanese context, Shinan's critique totally makes sense within the context of his thought, and it points to the spiritual dangers of the Buddha nature or original enlightenment doctrine. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking about this, or we're talking about this, is something that Shandao mentions in the Anakshu, where his disciple asks him, is it better to be talking about emptiness and oneness, or is it better to be attached to the idea of oneness and emptiness, or is it better to be attached on this dualistic notion of this evil world and going to the Pure Land? And then Tacho answers to him saying, it's better to be, if anything, it's better to be attached to the dualistic mindset, because at least within the dualistic mindset, there is a sense of direction, a teleology, so to speak, to go from this world of delusion to that of enlightenment. Whereas if you're attached to the idea of oneness, then you'll think everything is okay now, and you don't have to do anything. And so that was his response to it. And I think in a lot of respects that gets maintained by Shinran Shonin, in the sense that the idea of the establishment of the Pure Land and the adornments, the 48 vows, is this discussion of emptiness, of how it plays out when you do put a mythological story to it, right? And so that's how I think that the Jodo Shichiro Shinran Shonin's thought is on the significance of the story of Dharmakara in the larger sutra.
I was going to say, I think that's a really important point, because if we think about the way that emptiness is articulated by let's say Nagarjuna, for example, like emptiness is not some other thing, right? It's not like emptiness plus ordinary life. It's like emptiness is ordinary life understood, right? So in what we have in ordinary life is ideas about the self and myth and narrative, and I'm so and so from such and such family and all that. Like that's what we have, but we tend to ascribe coherence to that is getting in the way, and kind of deconstructing, or kind of recognizing the fluid nature of that reality. That's what emptiness is. Like it's not this other thing, right? So what I found so interesting, and this is something I've been kind of playing with recently, or thinking about, is why are the philosophers of emptiness either associated with the Pure Land mythos, or why is the Pure Land so often used by that, right? So there's a lot of people want to talk about emptiness. Translators of Mahayana texts into China who are translating the texts about emptiness and the Pure Land text at the same time. It's the same, same person translating the same texts. So for them, that was part of a coherent worldview, whether it's Kumarajiva or people before or after him, whether it's Kukai and Dohan, there are all these interesting thinkers that are finding coherence there. And I think it's because it's not putting two things together, but rather the mythological dynamic does something, right? And what that is emptiness or something. I don't know. This is something that I've been thinking about recently.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Oh, there was one question here by Lewis. Which Tiantai thinker or thinkers are you referencing with regard to the three truths? This is a question for Proffitt Sensei, is that?
Yeah. Oh, so the three truths is a fairly common Tiantai and Tendai heuristic for thinking about how emptiness and provisional reality fit together. I've been especially interested in the philosophical texts attributed, like the secret commentaries attributed to Genshin in medieval Japan, where they take the three truths and use the three syllables of Amitabha, Amita, to kind of render the three truths of emptiness, provisional reality, in the middle that unites them as imbued within the Nembutsu. Right, think of this, and then mantra thinkers play with this as well, because Tiantai and Tendai are such important, currents of thought within, East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. But also, I think it's important to see how everything overlaps with everything somewhere, right? So rather than thinking of it as one school of thought, like everything is kind of blending into everything else. Like, it reminds me of this. I was reading this message board in Taiwan, and these, there's some guy who's like, hey, do we have any Tiantai temples here? He was a Chinese Tendai, and this monk responded. He's like, well, that's not really how it works here, because like everyone is Zen technically, right? Like that's your lineage, but everyone studies Zhi and the Tiantai teachings because that's part of Chinese Buddhism, right? So everything is kind of fitting together, and you might go to the Nembutsu hall in your Nianfo hall, and you'll chant the name of Amitabha, and you might go to a lecture on the teachings of Zhi, and then on Wednesdays you sit zazen, or something like that. So it's like, we get this frame from Japan that these things are all separate, but then the rest of East Asia, they're really not. And actually, for most of Japanese history, they weren't either, right? So, these things are kind of around. Like Dohan talks about the three truths all the time. So here's my perspective, but this is something that especially in like Hongaku thought is a tool that people are playing with, right? Some of these have been translated. I believe, what's the one that Jacqueline Stone translated that was really good? I'm forgetting, but if you email me, I can send a reference. But yeah, a lot of it's just not translated yet.
Oh.
But anyway, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. I had a just kind of question for Curley Sensei here. You mentioned that there was the emphasis from the modern period on the idea of the self, and then I was thinking, like, when the Kamakura Buddhism kind of emerged, and we have Dogen, Nichiren, Honen, and Shinran kind of have their criticism against the establishment of Tendai and Shingon and the other kind of institutionalized Buddhist sects now, and that they kind of I've heard of scholars saying that they revitalized Buddhism during the kind of Kamakura period by refocusing on the self and the individual and the jiga, right? And going and creating a path from there, and the rest is kind of history for each of these individuals. And then comes along Kakunyo, who then talks about the difference between Naiso and Gesso, which is like this inner self and the outer self. And then the inner self should focus on the issue of Shinjin and how to be a Jodo Shinshu practitioner, but the Gesso, the outside demeanor, should be follow the rules of the state and be a good citizen, model citizen. Then you'll kind of takes this and runs with it as well. And so I was thinking, like, this. And then when we come to the Meiji period, we have this kind of reshift into this, back to the individual, which is not to say that, Nenya Shoni and Kakunyo Shoni were not focused on the individual, but, do you think that there is like this period of time where there's like this renaissance in the history of the Honganji or, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and then it kind of becomes institutionalized, and then someone comes along or a group of people then come and have this, again, renaissance of why are we even doing this? Why are we Buddhists? And they refocus back onto the individual. Is that kind of like a way to look at the history of Shinshu, or is it different between each of these periods?
That's such an interesting and valuable question. I will say for myself, my tendency is always sort of to hear about the people who are the villains within a tradition and just try to find a way to say, no, actually, they're great. So I really had that strong feeling that, you know, when I started first kind of read about the history of Shinchu, one very common way of organizing that history is by saying, we have the great master Shinran, and then we have Renyo. And he doesn't understand the tradition, and he turns it into a kind of church. And maybe someday someone will recover the original tradition. And I have always been like, but isn't Renyo actually pretty wonderful? And isn't he a fascinating person? So I guess I might not be exactly the right person to answer this question. It seems to me, what I know, there's so much that I don't know about the history, the long history. But what I do know is that one moment when that kind of pattern that you're describing of an individual experience of faith that then becomes institutionalized and then has to be kind of turned over and revitalized. One moment when it's very important, it seems very important for historians to describe the history of Japanese Buddhism that way, is in the immediate post-war. To say, we have this history in which a kind of individuals emerge who stand against the state, and then they sort of collapse into an institution that accommodates the state. And then out of that, an individual emerges again to stand against the state. So I don't think it's at all surprising that in the aftermath of the war, it is felt to be important to look into Japanese history and find people who stood against the state. I don't think that is necessarily producing the most meticulous kind of history, right? I think for one thing, it really tends to cover over the ways in which Shinran was not actually a Shinshu thinker, right? Like he didn't have an institution that he was founding, and sects did not exist, right? These kind of boundaries that we think of did not exist. So I think that way of thinking of like Shinran, Honen, Dogen, the individuals is probably covering over a lot of historical nuance, but as a way of, after the war, trying to find a history for yourself in which you can identify the resources and models for resisting an oppressive state. That's really important. That's still really important. So I see that narrative as kind of coming into focus in that moment and doing a particular kind of work, which I think is an important kind of work. It's not quite an answer to your question.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for the insights.
That's a really fun one. You know, something that comes to mind is that slogan, well-behaved women rarely make history, or something like this. The same is true with monks, right? All the people that we like to talk about, they're the dropouts, the quitters. Like Kukai dropped out of college, right? I tell my students this all the time. Like he dropped out of college and became a long-haired hippie or whatever, like chanting mantras in the mountains. And then he becomes one of the most important people in Japanese Buddhist history. Shinran as well. Like downtown Kyoto, there's this beautiful temple, Rokkakudo. I lived 10 minutes away. I'd go down there. My daughter would chase the pigeons would chase her. It was super cute. But they have this little statue of Shinran. Rokkakudo is where Shinran goes and has his vision of the Bodhisattva of compassion. That's where he's kind of dealing with his crisis of faith in the institution. And his cute little statue of him, it's little and it's cute. And he's sitting there, he's like, he's asleep. Like his head is cocked to the side and he's asleep, holding his nenju, right? Because it's, like Muchu no Shinran, like Shinran in the midst of dreams or something like that. And I just always loved that. A lot of the people that we have come to revere as the great practitioners, founders, Saicho, Kukai, Honen, Shinran, Nichiren, and so on, like that they, Dogen, they left to go do a new thing. And that had profound consequences for Japanese Buddhist history. And then like you look at the monks that like were good behaviors and they ran the institution and they ran the office or whatever, and like they're interesting and they're important. They did important things, but they're not the people that are the people are churning out books about necessarily, right? So that's something that I often think about. And then with Kamakura Buddhism, I just taught a really fun seminar. It was fun for me, I don't know the students, but for me, I had a really good time doing this seminar on Kamakura Buddhism. We just read Shinran, Nichiren, and Dogen. And one of the things that I've heard some modern Shin thinkers say about Shinran is that he really seems to, like his interiority is right on the surface, like his struggle with, life, his religion, his sexuality, these are all things that he's trying to process in his, in his life at that time. And I wanted to go back to a point I made earlier, is like the dominant institutions. And by the way, the great founders during that time, they were nobodies, right? If Shinran's wife Eshini had not supported him, if his daughter Kakashini had not established the institutional center of his mausoleum, he would maybe be a historical footnote, right? If that. During the Kamakura period, they had, meager influence, but as the big trees fell in the Warring States period, little trees rise, and these become the dominant institutions. But even into the Edo period, Jodoshu and Jodo Shinshu were still institutionally within the umbrella of Tendai, because that's the way that the institutions were working, right? You would go get ordained according to the tradition, in Nara or wherever. But then, like on the side, like you've got this secret teaching. Let me tell you about my bro Shinran. Like, he's really cool, right? And that's kind of it, this like almost secret context. It's not just the Tani show that was secret, like it was Shinshu too. I think that's really interesting. Your day job, you're a Tendai or Shingon monk or something, and you go on the side, but again, like a comment I made earlier about like the oneness of Buddhism at the time, the dominant institutions, whether it's Kofukuji, Todaiji, Hiezan, Koisan, or whatever. You've got all these different kinds of Buddhism, all these different texts, all these different practices, and so on. That's also a method for top-down control of everything, right? So people like Nichiren are saying, no, it's all about the Lotus Sutra, or Shinran saying, no, it's all about Nembutsu, or Dogen and Zazen. They're also trying to kind of carve out a place that is not dominated by these institutions, and that for people at the time, I think that had resonance, because these are powerful land-holding institutions with standing armies, and maybe you don't want to be under their thumb in the spirit of oneness, right?
Okay, we have some comments here. Lewis mentions again, Brooke Zipperin has taken on the three truths that raise interesting ethical problems, perhaps even dilemmas. The ethical dilemmas occur as part of an active flow and energetic dynamic between each truth. So that's one comment. And then the next one, we'll move on to, you said there were no sects in Shinran's day, but weren't there some 6 officially sanctioned schools, and was Honen accused of founding an unauthorized school? Let's see, 6 officials in Shinran's day. I think you might be referring that to the 6 Nara schools. Is that correct? If so, that's the not part of the Jodo Shinshu, but the Nara schools were of other traditions. And was Honen accused of founding an unauthorized school? Yes, he was, by the Shingon sect, as well as the Tendai, accused him of saying blasphemous things, such as the one about Myoe, who accuses him for not talking about Bodaishin and kind of taking that out of the context of Jodo, or of the teaching of Pure Land School. And so there was a lot of people who were criticizing him for not being authentically Buddhist. Okay, so moving on. Kukai Kobodashi often strikes one as a prototypical, perhaps even archetypal Yamabushi, as it is related by some parts of Shingon narrative. Nichiren Dai Shonin claimed to have discovered the true Tendai. Okay, so these are comments coming from Lewis. Okay, great, thanks. So we'll move on. One of the questions that I kind of had for Professor Sensei was just regarding the name, the Nembutsu, and you were talking about how that kind of lines up with the Namudaishi Henjo Kongo. And in Jodo Shinshu, there's a few other kind of sanctioned names as well, like that are equivalent to that of Namo Amida Butsu, which is Namo Fukashigi Ko Nyorai, Kimyo Jinjipo Muge Ko Nyorai. Namo Fukashigi Ko Butsu, this is another one. And so these are kind of considered interchangeable, but it doesn't kind of really lock into Namo Amida Butsu until Renyo's time. And so I was kind of thinking like, are those, when you say Nembutsu and within the Shingon tradition, do they also recognize these other names too as well? Or is it, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I feel like I've seen a couple different configurations, but this term Nembutsu, mindfulness of the Buddha, that's a real generic term, right? Like that can include, we've got our Kukai Nembutsu, you could say, Namu Daishin Henjo Kongo, you've got Kannon Nembutsu, Namu Kanzei Ondai Bosatsu, or, there are many, just plug in your different, Buddha, Bodhisattva, or God, and you could, kind of wrangle that into the concept of Nembutsu. And then, that's the vocal utterance. There's also contemplations that might be, accompany that. You can do both, or you can pick one, right? But yeah. I feel like that there's a couple other styles like Kimio, Nantoka, that you might encounter here and there. And I wanted to very briefly respond to this idea of, this question of sectarianism. This is one topic I think is really interesting. Like, in the modern period, both because of kind of the formation of Tokugawa sectarian institutions and the kind of Western academic kind of phylogenic approach to the study of Buddhism, with this idea that Buddhism is made of different kinds of Buddhism. Right. And that's the textbook presentation of Buddhism. You read the text, okay, well, that's the Nara school, that's the Heian school, whether it's time period or sect or whatever. And in contemporary Japan, that makes sense. That way of thinking about Buddhism doesn't necessarily make sense in the rest of contemporary East Asia or in a lot of pre-modern Japanese context. Basically, what would happen is like a monk would ordain and then study within a lineage, and then maybe study with a bunch of different teachers. And I love reading the biographies of monks because the first 2 paragraphs is then they studied here and here and here and this lineage and this lineage and this lineage. Sometimes those are like, after the fact, they kind of tack those on, but you could study, Tendai doctrine, the Avatamsaka Sutra, what we now call Keigon. You could study, Yogacara, Madhyamaka, Pure Land. To my students, when we talk about the so-called 6 Nara schools, I would almost call it the 6 Nara majors. I met this cool guy and decided to major in Yogacara, but then we broke up, and I decided to major in Madhyamaka. But I'm getting kind of tired of that, so I think I'm going to major in Pure Land. Finally, so people would study broadly, and there was a lot of incentive to be broadly educated. The rich aristocrat comes to your temple and says, I'd like you to perform some, esoteric dharani for my grandfather. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, it's not part of my sect. Oh, I'll take all my money somewhere else, right? So the incentive was to be broadly educated, broadly proficient, right? Whereas in the Tokugawa period and after, the incentive is to stay in line, to stick to your own and not bother anybody, because so it becomes a different world at that point, right? And that's the world that we've inherited, and that's the way of thinking about Buddhism, is kind of these different kinds, these categories that are real, but of course, that's kind of the textbook answer. But then you look at the lives of ordinary people in contemporary Japan. I know Shinshu people who will do a little dharani after the Shoshinge, or that they go to Koyasan, they buy the little Namo Daishi Hinjo Kongo jacket, but they got their Nishi Honganji Kesa, but they got the pilgrimage thing too going on. Or all my Shin friends in Kumamoto who would go to the big tourist attraction Shingon temple for the fire ceremony. It's like, why not, right? So things are fluid and interesting, and so don't worry too much about these categories. It's the raft to be let go when you cross the shores. Okay, I know what the 6 Nara schools are. I can forget that now, or something like that, right? Anyway.
Thank you. Okay, so any other questions? Okay, there's Lewis mentions here parts of these multiple varied prayers or mantras to a broad group of bodhisattvas or Buddhas do occur within Shingon liturgies. Thank you very much, Lewis. Any other questions or comments or anything? Yeah. Would it be possible if you could? Oh, okay, great. Great.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. We've been talking about the demythologization of Pure Land Buddhism, and so as a person who was trained in a fairly orthodox a very orthodox Honganji seminary, and kind of got the official party line in my ministerial education, there's a lot of points in the modern times when I feel like, at least on the Nishi side, there's kind of a pretty vigorous pushback against the demythologizing of the Pure Land tradition, and a kind of very full-throated affirmation of ideas like the Pure Land is a world into which we're born after we die, and a kind of a rejection of the ideas like this Yuishin Jodo and things like that. But and it's interesting to me to hear in Keta Sensei's writings a kind of, it almost feels a little bit like a sort of the defense or kind of apology for that perspective. Like there's a kind of returning, sort of going in a sort of postmodern way to sort of come back to this. And so I'm wondering, is your sense that we're sort of do you think we're coming into a moment where thinkers in Japan will be kind of sort of settling into more of that perspective? Because I think the image that I have often is that Higashi Honganji has embraced kind of more of this demythologizing thinkers, and in that sense is more suited to the modern person, and Nishi Honganji is kind of falling behind. But are the tables turning in that regard in some ways? Thank you.
I muted you, Sensei.
Oh, please.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to come
Yes,
up?
yeah, please. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sensei, for wonderful presentation. And then, yeah, I kind of agree with Henry Sensei's comment or question. So, what is myth? So, who decides myth? So, maybe from our bomb mind, oh, this story, this narrative is myth. And then our discernment is really reliable. And then another approach is, so is this a myth or manifestation of truth in a skillful way, so that us Bonbu can have a better understanding? So can you talk about like a Hoben, like a Donlan's discussion for Koryak Sonyu, so like or also like a Buddha body theory too. So what we call myth versus like a Hoben manifestation, how do you kind of reconcile those points?
These questions are the people who should be answering these questions. I think maybe you already did a little bit kind of gesture toward your answers to these questions. I agree with, I think, what I take to be the implications here, that first of all, to identify the narrative as a myth is taking a big, bold step. If you are identifying it that way, I think it can only be because you have already kind of committed yourself to a particular view of the world and particular kinds of kind of science of religion understandings. I think it's an interesting dynamic to me that Professor Tanaka is critical of demythologization, but also very interested in using the term myth. He thinks, oh no, we should identify it as myth, but not demythologize. I want to say, I think to me, it seems actually quite challenging to hold those two moves apart in a certain way. But I think if he was here, maybe he would say something like, well, facts are one order of reality, and what we call myth is another order of reality, and maybe a deeper and more significant kind of reality. I think a lot in relation to this about Charlie Hallisey, who works on Theravada Buddhist literature, talking about two very different ways of encountering a religious text. And he's thinking with some scholars of myth when he puts it this way. He has said, I think in fact it was in this very room where he made this suggestion some years ago, that you can encounter a religious text as though you are reading a newspaper article. So you might be reading a newspaper article that's describing a car accident. And you can read that newspaper article that describes a car accident, and you know, oh, this car accident happened. That's one way of reading the text. And there's another way of encountering a text, which is you get a telegram. It's obviously an old story. You get a telegram that says, call me right away. There's been an accident. This is the same content, right? There was a car accident and there was a car accident, but they're two totally different ways of encountering the significance of a text. So I think Charlie wants to say that if you're in the world in which the myth has traction, it hits you like the telegram hits you. You can know that it's from the past, but it reaches out from the past and kind of speaks to you directly in the present. It's just for you. It's a message that is just for you. So to me, a kind of challenge for the contemporary practitioners seems to be, can you hold on to both of these ways of thinking at the same time? It's another way of asking that question is, can you do a kind of religious studies approach to a text, which can say, this is a myth and we can identify some roots of this myth, without that approach kind of interfering with the direct way in which the text is speaking to you? That's an unsettled question for me, what the proper relationship is between scholarship in the religious studies mode and religious thinking and religious reading. One last thing, and this is very unformed, I know, but a last thing that I want to say, it's kind of, I think this question of like, who gets to say that it's a myth is a really, really good one. And for me, it resonates with another question that contemporary thinkers are asking, which is, who gets to say the world is disenchanted? Right? There's a kind of agreement in these very elite circles, so the thinkers that I'm looking at in the turn of the century, that yes, the world has no magic in it anymore. But lots of philosophers now are saying, hold on, well, we didn't all agree that there's no magic in the world. Actually, many of us can describe moments of very profound enchantment, and can that be brought into a kind of philosophy of religion approach? Because it seems to me that in relation to this question of like, can the story still work on us? For sure, if we have that moment of an enchanted encounter with something that's not quite comprehensible to us, yeah, why wouldn't that story then seem to work on us? And in fact, we do encounter very profound kinds of terrifying and beautiful enchantment all the time. I think if we can learn to attune ourselves to those moments, then maybe that world that was available to Shinran will become even more and more available to us. Yeah, if we just tuned into that frequency.
I have to marinate on that a little bit. I was thinking about something that a couple things you said. One of them about how Keta mentions childbirth, as being a thing. There's this like fundamental recognition of your interconnectedness with another being, and but also what you've said about magic and these things that happen, and this question of, is the world actually deprived of magic? It makes me think about when my daughter was born, and one of these profound moments where everything shifts and everything changes. It's like there was a moment where I was just a dedicated PhD student about to have a kid, and my work was very much on my mind, too much. And then suddenly everything changes. A clear hierarchy between the things that matter, the things that don't matter, was imposed upon me by the world. This new being, or this time around, this new being was here to declare, I matter. Everything else you thought is gone. Like, yep, I agree. Yes, 100%. Right. And she spends too much time with me. She's a good little skeptic. It's like, oh, magic. Magic's not real. I was like, sweetie, magic's real. You're real. You're magic. We've had this conversation. But anyway, so it also reminds me, whenever I spend time, a significant amount of time in Japan, whether for a visit or a longer stay, the gods are everywhere. Like, hey, Jizo-sama, what's up, Amaterasu? Hey, Ganesha, how you doing? Every day I'm walking down the street, turn the corner, it's ubiquitous. Come back to the U.S., like, where's the gods? Turn the corner, it's just a guy. It's, I mean, maybe he's secretly, an esoteric manifestation that my benighted eyes don't see. But like, where's all the gods? And I have that feeling every time I come back. And I really like this word myth, and there have been plenty of people to try to, so like, in religious studies context, we use the word cult, right? In popular American English, cult is bad, right? That's the bad kind of religion. That's the kind we don't like. In like religious studies, academic parlance, because we like to make up words, cult is just like the thing that people are like focused on, right? The cult of Kannon, the cult of Amitabha, the cult of Jesus, like whatever. Like these are basically value neutrals. Like here's these people, and this is what they're into, right? I think the word myth, people have tried to rehabilitate that as well. Popular parlance, so like there's the real things, then there's the myths. But like I think sometimes in religious studies, parlance, we say myth meaning kind of that what was is that Heidegger life world, like that life world that people inhabit, and we all have those. And maybe yours is infused with I don't know, baseball and liberal politics, or maybe yours is infused with like esoteric mantras and yoga or something. But we all have kind of the perspective that we're in. And I really liked Kuwahara Sensei's comment about the myth as opposed to what? Your mind that is real. And then that makes me think of one of my favorite sutras, the Pratyupana Samadhi Sutra, right? The Pratyupana Samadhi Sutra inspires a lot of Pure Land movement. So like, Tiantai Zhi takes that as the foundation for his, one of his fourfold samadhis, right? Which becomes part of the foundation for Japanese Pure Land thought, right? But within the Pratyupana Samadhi Sutra, I think the point is to say, here's the Pure Land and here's you. It's not that one is imaginary and you're the real one. Let's bring these two things into tension with one another, to where this real mind, this is the real one, like that begins to break down. And, in this kind of almost Madhyamaka-esque tension is created, kind of playing on it. What do you think you know about the Pure Land? What do you think you know about your own mind? And, both going to the Pure Land is part of the conversation, but also the Pure Land being here and now. That's how you talk to Amitabha and learn from him. And these things are kind of held together. And then, there's a fair amount of people in the rest of Mahayana history trying to work out what that means. And that's a problem I think is really interesting. And that's what I wrote down to talk about. So that's awesome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that myth hunt, it's been used in the colloquial sense as something that's fake and not real. But I think in the academic way, setting of that word defining myth is that it has a didactic purpose within it to show us, something significant, which is in this case a breakdown of the self and to question what your being is. Anyway, thank you very much. I wanted to thank everybody for their participation today, and I think it's come to that time to bring this to a close. And I wanted to thank the presenters once again for their very thought-provoking presentations today. And I wanted to thank all of you guys out in Zoom who participated in today's seminar. Thank you very much for joining. A Zoom lander, yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.